Cool.
Oh, wow.
Alrighty. I hope you're happy with that, Scott. So
Yeah. No,
yeah.
no worries. No worries. I'll try to swear slightly fucking less.
Oh,
No,
fantastic.
swim more, and then that way they can't distribute it anywhere.
Yeah. So we're privileged enough tonight to have all the way from Matakana. We've got Scott from Sawmill, and he's going to give us a wee presentation on where he's been in the recent offshore experience and how he's left Sawmill, come back home to a slightly different COVID world. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah. Evening, everyone. Yeah, obviously, as well introduced by Reese. My name's Scott. I've sort of been living overseas in the UK for a couple of years. I guess my background in brewing, for you all who are wondering, is been in the brewing industry full time since 2013, and hilariously, my sort of origin story is the opposite of many. In fact, I actually started working in a craft brewery to learn how to homebrew. Which, yeah, I was volunteering at a brewery in Christchurch called Wigram while I was studying at university, and sort of got bit by the bug so much. I basically just wanted to learn how to make decent piss at home, and yeah, which they really helped with. And so I sort of set up my first all grain kit, yeah, sort of 12 or 13 years ago, and sort of got bit by the bug. And after I finished up uni, I sort of ended up applying for brewing jobs because I just sort of couldn't get enough of it. And yeah, ended up at Good George in Hamilton in 2013. Brewed there for sort of 2.5 years in a trainee role, then up into sort of managing packaging.
So was Kelly around then, or was that after that?
So Kelly left, and that created 2 trainee roles, basically.
Right.
Which I assume was literally, yeah, like splitting his salary in 2 and then paying us slightly less. And yeah, so that basically allowed myself to come in as a trainee, and then also my pal Brent, who was brewing there up until relatively recently, and he's now moved over to Aussie and is brewing in Wollongong for 3 barrels, something barrels anyway.
3 to 5 barrels.
Yeah, definitely somewhere in there. And yeah, so I was there for sort of 2.5 years and did a bit of everything. Trained on brewhouse cellars, and was have the dubious record of filling the first squealers at Good George on our very first bottling line there, which wasn't so much a bottling line as a very small bottling cabinet. And yeah, then sort of got a bit bored and moved up to Matakana in sort of 2015-16 for Sawmill, the brand new site, sort of just by the Omaha turnoff, which some of you might be familiar with. And was sort of the brewer and lead brewer there for a good 3 years, before spending a couple of years brewing in the UK. And now I'm back again, and sort of a quality technical innovation manager hat, many hats, lots of hats role. But basically just trying to make beer taste good and always be awesome, and making new beers that also taste good, is how I would put it. And yeah, for anyone's interest too, I think this is quite interesting, but I was brewing for a chap in the UK who's just started his own brewery, but he has quite a lot of heritage in the New Zealand brewing scene because he was the head brewer at Max Wellington Waterfront, a chap called Colin Page. So I mean, he created like Brugelé and Great White and Hop Rocker and those sort of beers.
Oh,
so
we had Alyssa from Lion on a couple of weeks back, and so she's doing the new product development for those brands as well. So yeah, a bit of an overlap there.
Cool. So yeah, which brewery has Colin started?
It's one called Round Corner Brewing.
Cool.
Yeah. So I was basically his. Well, he had a brewer, a French guy, for a few months, but I was his pretty much first brewer, really, besides himself, and a part-timer. So that was pretty cool. Yeah, I actually got put in touch by Kelly, ex Fork and Brewer, now Boneface.
Right.
Yeah. So small world actually, but yeah. So relocated to his part of the world, which is sort of East Midlands of England, and yeah, ended up brewing there for sort of 1.5 years, and a bit of everything, to be honest. Like we were brewing European style lagers, American style pale ales, and cask beer. as well. So yeah, it's been really cool.
Oh, so you got to learn some cask stuff as well.
Yeah. To be fair, it's actually not as complicated as I expected, but
Well, just involves more time, doesn't it?
well, surprisingly less time actually. Like cask breweries are turning around batches in like literally 7 days, pretty much.
Right.
9 days. Yeah, because it's usually quite low gravity, and it's usually like a relatively warm ferment with an English ale strain, so it just chomps through. Yeah, and then
What sort of strains were you using? Like Nottingham or?
Well, we tried quite a few, to be honest. Yeah, first we tried, for quite a while, we were trying the Hopback Brewing. They're famous for their beer Summer Lightning, I think. Like one of the first sort of hoppy English pale ales in the 90s. Colin, my old boss, used to work there, so he actually managed to get a hold of a whole bunch of their yeast. So we were rolling that for quite a while. It was pretty good. We were using like a Whitbread derivation for a while. And then we also got a hold of someone else's yeast as well. We were quite close to Leicester City, so we got a hold of Everard's yeast, which is sort of the family cask brewery in the area. We got a hold of their yeast for a bit too, because we're actually, strangely enough, doing a bit of contract work for them, which was cool. Yeah, and I did a little bit of brewing over there for Yeasty Boys UK, which was a strange sort of circular thing as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that's pretty much what I've been up to, and yeah, so I've been an essential worker in 2 different countries making beer, which is cool. Thankfully, it's kept me busy. Otherwise, I would have been bored shitless, and might have, I don't know what I would have done, to be fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of everything. So now back at Sawmill and dialing things in with the mostly fresh faces there. Yeah, obviously you guys would be familiar with like Sam Williamson. He left probably a year ago, I want to say. And we've sort of got a couple of brewery stuff that are still the same from when I was last there. But yeah, she's a bit bigger, to be fair, even with the fire in my absence as well. Like there's definitely yeah, she's pretty busy around the place.
Yeah, so when's that? That's not open to the public yet, is it? Because you're still within the Auckland sort of borough at the moment, aren't you? So that's...
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so they're just, all the front of house staff are basically gearing up now for next week, next Friday.
Right.
Yeah, which is bloody great, because yeah, it's so I mean, yeah, for any of you who are interested, Sawmill Brewery, obviously, been a bit of an institution for a while, but originally founded mid-2000s by the original owners, Peter and Decima Freckleton, who sort of like brewed a lot of lager beers, which is quite untrendy then and still fairly untrendy now, in my opinion. And they sold it to the current owners, Mike and Kirsty, who bought it in like 2010, and have had it since. And so basically when I came on board in whatever it was, 2015 or 16, we'd just changed out from the old site at Lee on the same site as the Sawmill Cafe, which is no affiliation, and yeah, confusingly. And yeah, basically into a brand new 2,500 litre brewery and a custom built site in Matakana, or just out of Matakana. And that's sort of where we still are. The system's gotten a bit more complicated and we've gotten a lot more fermenters since the start, that's for sure. Batch sizes are much larger.
Yeah, so what's your mashing in size now?
Well, we're still running 25 hectoliter brew lengths. So our ton and kettle are all, and whirlpool are all maxed out at sort of, wow, we run 26 hectoliters through them, so 2,600 liters. But we're sort of just in the process of basically expanding. So we're going to be looking at buying. Well, the brewery will be looking at buying a 50 hectoliter, so 5,000 liter brew length kit.
Right. So if you're doing something like the Doctor, you double batching that, or you?
It didn't used to be the case, but now literally pretty much everything is minimum of double batch. So
right.
So it's basically, I mean, it's pretty standard to be doing. We're not a 7-day-a-week brewery, but like we're brewing twice a day, 5 days a week. And I mean, our largest fermenters are now 10,000 liters. So we sort of got, we've got a suite of, how many are there? Like
You've been running 10s for quite a while though, haven't you?
Yeah, we've had the 10s. We've had the 10s since before I left, like well before I left, to be fair. We've had them since 2017, I think. They're awesome lager tanks. They're really, really good for pils, quite good for the core range lager as well.
So 4 batches will go into those then, is it?
Yeah. So brewed over the course of 2 days. So you basically give it all the oxygen.
So it's your slow version of continuous fermentation.
No, it's batch brewing, just like over a 48-hour period.
It's just 4 batches.
Yeah. Yeah, look, it's one of those things that it's like fermentation space is easier than more like a new brew house, basically, because of the because a fermenter really only needs to be hooked into glycol, whereas the brew house is hooked into a lot more other things. Like it's it's a bit more complicated, and you've got to punch holes in the roof for the brew house if you've got direct fire and stuff like that for the condensate to travel out.
Right.
But basically, so that's sort of how we're rolling, and we've got about, trying to remember, I think we might need to recalculate it, but we've got about 80,000 liters of fermentation space and about 25,000 liters of bright beer tank space. So we've got 4 bright beer tanks as well.
How do you find that, like when you ferment, like when you 4 batches over 2 days, does that sort of affect your fermentation profile at all? I mean, like, what is there anything you sort of got to cater and compensate for there when you actually sort of got the almost a 24-hour lag between sort of batches of wet production?
It does hugely depend on what you're brewing, like whether it's an ale or a lager as well. Like ales are definitely ripping off by the next day.
I was going to say you're almost going to be sort of a third of the way through ferment when you're dosing in the next one.
Yeah, well, basically what we do is we pitch. So if you're brewing over 2 days, you give it all the oxygen on the first day, and you basically pitch the amount of yeast that you need for your first 2 brews on the first day. With the idea being that you get enough cell replication from those first 2 brews of oxygenated wort then that carries through the final 2, which are not oxygenated. So
you don't reintroduce, right?
Yeah, so if you guys are like yeast nerds, you're talking about aerobic and anaerobic fermentation. And so during aerobic, you get very little gravity drop, and during aerobic fermentation, all you really get is cell replication.
Sterile production,
they're very efficient at that during aerobic respiration because they've got oxygen, they've got sugar. They only eat a tiny little bit and they make a whole bunch more cells. But as soon as they hit anaerobic, that's alcoholic fermentation, which is obviously what we kind of want. I mean, we want both, but yeah, as soon as they hit anaerobic, then you sort of don't want to introduce more oxygen unless you necessarily want more cells or potential oxidation problems as well. So it tends to be that, you basically pitch the right amount of yeast and heaps of oxygen on the first day to get the total cell count to drive you through.
And that works all right for the lager strains?
Well, it works best for them because they tend to be more laggy to start with anyway. Because we're fermenting our house lager yeast is White Labs 830, so German lager, the Weihenstephan, standard Weihenstephan yeast that's used by
And you're doing the 10 degrees or something?
Yeah, and our primary is at 10 degrees, so she's pretty cold. So she's usually a bit slow to start, depending on how far through the generations we are. But so that tends to be quite good for lagers. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, ales, they're a lot more vigorous fermentations. They're warmer. We're using for most of our core range ales, like IPA, XPA, we're using the Chico strain. So it's very, it's pretty much straight into it as soon as you introduce it to the wort.
So you're pretty much a White Labs factory then, are you? Or
no, we're actually, well, it's fantastic question. I'm glad you asked that. But we hilariously must be one of the very few. We propagate our own yeast, and we're literally doing it from homebrew size packets.
Right.
But what I've started to shift to is using, conveniently in my absence, there's been a yeast startup based out of the Hutt Valley called Froth Technologies.
Mhm.
And I've started to bring their yeast in because honestly, it's their QA is awesome, and they basically have the same strains that we use, but on their own slants. They're a bit more expensive than what we have been doing, but they're way more reliable. So I've changed over. Our hazy strain is now one of theirs. We'll probably give a go of their Chico strain next and just bring that in and just, yeah, I mean, the money makes total sense. It makes sense that we don't have to import yeast from, we don't have to be getting yeast in from the States when we can have perfectly good yeast from Wellington. Sports is another small local business. So I'm basically looking at completely changing over all of our house strains to.
And will you still do the same kind of scale, or the scale ups from there? We had those guys on 3 weeks back, I think. So yeah, we had a good presentation from them, and because they're going to make their stuff available on the home brew scale, and same thing, will be a little bit more expensive in the home brew, but then you'll get I think they're talking about 2 billion cells, or something.
You'll get an adequate pitch size, unlike white yeast and white labs, which have always been under pitches in a 19.
Well, Sto's a 12 gram sachet by all accounts of dried. So
yeah, dried's quite difficult though, because they don't actually give you cell counts on them. They just say use this amount of dried yeast and it should be about right. Yeah, they're a bit more difficult because they also have way higher rates of yeast death than dried yeast too. Like the freeze drying process is super harsh. And
they have a shitload of yeast into them in this attrition model. Yeah.
It actually varies hugely by manufacturer, by the way. Like I talked to some new brewer friends I made in the UK, and they were saying none of you is from none of you has interest in any dried yeast labs, right? No, good.
That'll be enough.
Basically, the fermentus stuff by far has the best viability of any of them. Some of the Mangrove Jacks range has cell viability is lower than 50%. Whereas if you're in fermentus, you're sort of looking at 70-ish% viability, which is pretty good for that process.
What about the lemon stuff?
I think it's somewhere in between the two. I mean, Mangrove Jacks is actually all repacked with other brands anyway. They don't actually do their own. It's all repacked fermentus or Lallemand. So and they often blend. I think they blend yeast as well. So that
didn't they have a crack? I thought they bought an ex-bakery yeast production facility in the UK that they were doing some of their own stuff through or something like that. I'm not sure exactly. But
you might be right. You might be right.
I think that was one of the things that Peter acquired. And so, I mean, whether it was all set up for baking though. So, I mean, there's a big difference between, but what people don't realize is, I mean, like fermenters, their primary focus is not brewing yeast, it's baking yeast. I mean, brewing yeast is a tiny little slice of what they do.
Yeah, and Dean, just for your question, fermentus is all the Saf Ale and Saf Lager range. Yep, they're those ones. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Look, I don't particularly like using them commercially because of the huge rate of wild yeast and bacteria in dried yeast, which for us, we like reusing yeast. So it becomes a real issue over multiple generations, especially if you're doing low BU beers like hazies. It's a huge issue. So I mean,
you reckon there's actually a lot more impure product in their cultures?
Oh yeah, it's on their spec sheets. I mean, it's not as secret by any means. It's like one. So their guarantees for lactic acid bacteria and for wild yeast strains are less than 1 per million cells.
It's still pretty high.
When you're pitching billions of cells, that's very, very high. And so there's plenty of commercial breweries that if you repitch too long, basically in low BU beers, it can sour and stuff like that. There was a particularly famous case of Stone and Wood Pacific Ale going sour at like 8 months in bottle because it's quite low BUs and they were using USO5 and they were repitching it for quite a lot of generations. So it's quite a well-known issue commercially. That's why lots of people that use dried yeast will use it for like 2 or 3 generations and then dump it. which is pretty expensive, but yeah, it's easy, which is the only thing I could say for it. But yeah. Anyway, I might just crack a Pilsner myself. I've just been drinking some Lager. But yeah.
Pilsner's always bloody yum. Are you struggling to get Rewalker for it these days, or you got enough? I mean, you had to tweak the recipe much, or you managed to secure?
Well, I have great news on that front, which is that again, while I've been away, we've gone from some sort of situation where you have to like literally sell your firstborn to New Zealand hops to try to get an increased allocation of Rewalker, to pretty much the exact opposite, which is now we just tell them what they want and they tell us the price and we say yes. So so we're actually just looking at allocations for next year at the moment with New Zealand hops and also Clayton hops as well. And they both have not put a limit on what we can ask for, basically.
Oh, cool.
Which is awesome. So I've actually started reformulating some core recipes to include Rewalker. We've had some pretty, in my opinion, significant quality issues with American hops recently, which I'm happy to delve into later as well. But basically, it sort of led to us rethinking some of our beers and sort of thinking that if we can champion stuff that comes from New Zealand and make awesome beers out of it, we'd rather do more of that. And I mean, we already are one of the biggest users in the craft sector of New Zealand hops. So yeah, we're always keen to use more as well.
You've got your the little hop growing program outside. It's just mainly for the show and tell, is it?
Oh, the Cascades, yeah. No, they're good. That's actually been my other lockdown project, to be fair. But although they're getting a bit scraggly again, but yeah, we
They'd be shooting up now, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they're about they're getting up to waist height. I actually really need to get strings over and start training them, to be fair, because they're sort of going everywhere at the moment. But she's been a bit busy recently. But yeah, so they're Cascades and they seem to be going all right. We've made one beer out of them in the past, but it sounds like the last couple of years they've sort of been neglected and so haven't done shit all, to be fair. But it's all hooked up with sprinkler, like we've got drippers and everything set up there, so it's actually all pretty much ready to go. I've been through and fertilized them a couple of times. They're getting irrigation now, so they're all super happy. I just need to actually train them now.
Well, I think the hop guys down now, so at that kind of height, that they lock them off and then make them go again, and then they come up less leafy and things. So
yeah, lopping off is generous. Actually, I'm pretty sure they use Roundup.
Yeah.
At sort of they would use that when they first start coming out in sort of August, I think, September. They just spray them all off, tell them to go back to bed for a while.
Yeah.
We haven't done that. Which
you think that's bad? You see some of the sort of hot research that they're looking at, which is like Chris Little down at Lincoln, and the plant pheromones, where plants, when they stress, produce more of the thiols and all the kind of flavors you want in hops. But they found that, like something they found in the wine industry, is that if one plant was stressed, it would actually throw out sort of like pheromones and shit that would cause the plants next door to it to, respond as well. So they're looking at research where you have like one nice healthy plant and then one next to it that you beat the living shit out of it to see if you can cause more flavors in the surrounding. I think it's brilliant.
Is that the one you play death metal to?
No. They literally going out and just beating the crap out of it.
Oh my God. Fantastic. Well, that's great, because maybe we'll get something really good out of our hops then. That sounds good to me.
Because you've abused them.
Absolutely.
I've tried, but they're hard to abuse, to be fair. They're pretty.
Stopping them going leafies, you're concerned, I think.
Yeah, for sure. They definitely tend towards vegetative. I mean, I've already been through once and hacked them all back to like 3-liter shoots, and already they've all regrown about 17,000 other shoots. So I need to go back through that again too. But it's interesting what you say though, David, as well, because some types of stress definitely increase aromatics, but also you can get like if you have mite pressure, like spider mites and stuff like that, that's when a lot of like American and New Zealand hops will produce those oniony and garlicky characters, because they actually produce it as like a natural insecticide. Basically, they create sort of an unpalatable taste for them, which then carries over as well.
Yeah.
What about, have you got any insights to what was happening in the UK in the hop front?
Yeah, what do you want to know?
Well, I mean, have they got their own research programs, or is it all just all the noble things, or are there new things coming on, or what's happening over there?
Yeah, like lots of things, they're desperately trying to catch up with all of us who move a bit faster. But yeah, they're doing their very best. They do have hop breeding programs, which are obviously all geared towards trying to create new world hop varieties now, with patchy success, in my opinion. We brewed a fresh hop beer, UK Beaujolais, believe it or not, with a hop called Endeavour, which was sort of promised as, you know, one of these much more new world hops, and
it wasn't a bit cocked.
It wasn't very good, sadly.
That was an Endeavour joke.
It was a historical joke.
Terrible.
Yeah, right. It's good though. I like a good cheesy historical joke. Yeah, I mean, we brewed with a few of the different newer varieties of English stuff, and they were all okay, but they were still quite inherently noble for sure.
And what sort of alphas are they coming out as?
All over the place. Like Endeavour was low double digits, but like still really quite low oil content. Then their breeding programs, I would say to date, haven't been very good at typically what most breeding programs are doing is they're trying to breed for a really high oil content, which tends to always come at the same time as alpha acids. So you tend to get like that sort of thing where if alpha acids go up, your essential oils go up, which means that a lot of these new varieties are high in both. And I would say that they have probably maybe a bit too much of that noble heritage in there, where they're sort of getting alphas going up, but they're not getting the you know, the corresponding increase in essential oils. And also the essential oils that are there are still all those like really spicy ones, you know, like sort of farnesene and stuff like that. Like it's quite, but that being said, apparently some of the Godiva is supposed to be pretty good. I mean, we'd never brewed with that. I brewed with Jester and Endeavour, I think were the newer ones that we used. And I was sort of fairly nonplussed, but I mean, I'm from New Zealand, so, you know.
Is this university based, or what's the source?
It's both private and university, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
I don't think we're seeing almost any of their even test batches down in New Zealand. I mean, I suppose why bother, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because it's Charles Ferrum usually selling them. To be fair, I don't think they have any direct sales in New Zealand even for commercials. So like, yeah.
It's hard enough to get, there's like King Goldings and stuff like that down here, let alone, you know, some of their more interesting ones.
Yeah. Look, actually, like we were using quite a bit of Goldings and Fuggles and various beers, and Challenger. Actually, Challenger is awesome if you get a really good lot of fresh Challenger. And to be honest, they were all lovely. Like as long as you're using them in the right applications, and they were insanely cheap. Like we were getting from one specific farmer, we're getting Fuggles at like 8 or 10 pounds a kilo or something like that. You know, like
in the cone form, or
no, we were a pellet brewery. Yeah.
So is each farmer pelletizing there, or?
That's a really good question. I actually never really got into that, but no, I don't think so. They all have their own oast houses, so they're drying them, same as what they would be doing in New Zealand, where they're all dried on farm, and then they'll be sent elsewhere for pelletization, I would say. I mean, obviously in the UK, there's a lot more use of actual cone hops and plug hops. So you can definitely get them direct from farmers a lot more in that form, but pelletizing is all done on bulk scale, I'm pretty sure.
So at the brewery you're at, did you use any in the cone form then?
Only for the green hop beer. And the same as what we would do in New Zealand. Yeah, turn the mash tun into a hop pack, basically.
Right.
But I mean, our setup was very unusual for an English brewery, I would say. Like for anyone interested, like the brewery setup was, we had a 2,000 liter kit, but we had a steam boiler. So we had like a mash conversion vessel where we were doing multi-step mashes. So it was very European, and then a lauter tun, and then a combination kettle whirlpool. But the kettle itself was run by like an external calandria, so basically a steam, like a steam heat exchanger essentially, which is actually really nice. But yeah, so
as far as control goes, you mean?
Really nice for control, really nice for like some styles of beer. You get way better foam retention because your steam temperature is much closer to boiling point. So like for us, we're using like direct fire boiler. So your delta T, like your difference in temperature between what the burner chamber is operating at and your actual wort temperature is huge. So it's a lot harsher. Whereas when you're using like steam at 108 degrees, it's really, it's a lot gentler. So you get a lot more retention of foam positives and stuff like that. I mean, it's really good for particularly continental lager styles. Like it's amazing. But yeah, it was really interesting because it's a really different way of brewing. I mean, all commercial breweries in New Zealand are pretty much single infusion, that's it. Whereas we were multi-step in a lot of our core range.
So 55, 60, 65 steps or?
Yeah, usually protein rest and 2 saccharifications and then a mash out.
So the mash out was even higher than.
Someone's got their background on.
Oops, sorry.
I think we're okay.
Are we good? Yep.
So the mash outs were, you're going up to 70, 75 or something, were you? Or
78, yeah.
So what are you achieving with that mash out step then?
Say again, sorry?
What are you achieving with that mash out step?
Well, you're trying to denature saccharification enzymes. Whether or not that actually happens at 78 is probably another debate. Believe it or not, it takes at least high 70s to early 80s to denature those enzymes. They still work in some form.
But if they're going to boil anyway, what is it? Is that more on a brewery scale than a home brew scale that it's a concern?
Well, how long does lautering take for you at home?
Oh, maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 30.
Most time brewers lauter too fast. Yeah.
Yeah, commercially you're looking between an hour and 2 hours.
Right.
Depending on the setup. So if you think about your mash as whatever, you're locking in your fermentable sugar profile for half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever, until it's done. But then obviously if your mash bed is never getting higher than 75, you've still got enzymatic activity going on.
Right.
So basically we would finish the mash conversion with a mash out step to try to denature the saccharification enzyme and fix our fermentable sugar profile in place.
Right.
And in my experience, it did definitely work better. Like you had more control over terminal gravities through mashing than I would say what you have on a single infusion. Whereby like in single infusion, we're kind of still trying to do the same thing, but we're doing it with sparge temperature. So like we're sparging at 78, 79, something like that, to try to bring the grain bed up to the point where you're denaturing those enzymes.
How much of a difference do you find a higher mash out step does for your lautering and
well, obviously it also helps runoff as well, because basically the hotter the temperature, the less viscosity. So like if you're running off at whatever, 67 or something like that compared to 75, that wort is considerably more viscous at that temperature than it would be as higher.
So you get more yield, essentially.
No, it's just easier. It's just easier to run off, really.
Right.
Less risk of a stuck mash. Probably not so much. Yeah, when you get into sort of stuff that can mesh out there, it's good to do.
it's also more consistent. I mean, that's the thing too, is like, pretty much with a given grist, no matter what size the grist is, it'll pretty much be similar every time, which is quite nice. I even found that with we did a couple of batches of Imperial Stout in my last job as well, and like didn't need any hulls, just mashed it out quite hot. And even with specialty malts and stuff like that, we didn't have a huge issue with lautering, which was awesome. Yeah.
So the other question I had was around being closer to the UK and European grains. Was there a freshness difference or a difference in the grains being closer to home?
Yes. Big difference. Yeah. It's something that I'm having to cope with, I guess you'd say.
Good luck.
It's yeah, I have many thoughts on this actually, but from my understanding, we only have so many actual malting barley varieties which will happily grow in New Zealand because we're a maritime climate. A lot of malting barley varieties have been created in continental Europe, where it has a completely different climate than here. And so to my feeling is that with the varieties we have in New Zealand, we can only create probably what we're already creating. Whereas in the UK and Europe, you have a much longer history of malting barley. You have a lot greater variety of the barley types themselves. And then also on top of that, you have more experience in farmers and maltsters. So malt over there is fucking great. We were using, our British malt that we were using was Crisp, who are little maltings out sort of Norfolk way. We had a really good relationship with them, and even just their base pale ale malt was just absolutely primo. It was so nice every time. Great extract, easy to use, also great flavor. And for all of our continental sort of lager styles, which we had basically a core range pale lager, which is basically a German Pils, and like core range Schwarzbier. Both of those had like a Bamberger Pils malt. So it's not Weyermann, but there's another maltings in Bamberg in Germany, which, yeah, is just called Bamberg maltings, and their Pilsner malt is excellent. So yeah, so that was sort of the two main suppliers we were using over there, and they were both really quite good. We were using Simpsons for specialties over there as well, because they're really good too. They were like significantly more expensive than Crisp for the base malt, but their specialties were probably, above the game again. Yeah, I do miss those base malts, I gotta tell you.
What about the malts that that we do get, down things like Golden Promise near Marisota? How well do they travel? Like, I mean, once they've sort of been shipped down here compared to what you might have been sort of using in terms of the profile you get from them when they're fresher in the UK, is there much of a diff, or is it more just the variety you can get in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably stuff's going to be older here. I mean, the interesting part of that though is that a lot of people in the UK, like commercial breweries, don't have malt mills. They actually buy pre-milled malt from the maltsters. So it's a little bit hard to compare because, to be fair, they also do experience greater oxidation of that malt because it's already milled in bags. But like, I never noticed anything overtly stale about what we were using. But honestly, I'd have to brew something with some European malt again and let you know. It's been only Gladfield since I've gotten back, pretty much, and sadly, COVID's knocked my a few of my seasonal beers on the head for now, which we tend to do draft only. So I'm still waiting for an opportunity to try to get some continental stuff in and some English stuff back in as well.
Cool.
Yeah, Kelly was. We had Kelly Ryan on recently, and he said when he was it Thornbridge, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, when he was there, they used to get it delivered by the truckload, crushed.
A month's worth crushed each
A
time.
month worth.
And he said they weren't treating it kindly either. It was in a big hopper out the back with a tarp over it, wasn't it? Outside.
Yeah.
And he didn't think there were any downsides to that. They didn't notice any issues with that.
No, you're getting it really fresh there, to be fair as well. Like it's Like you're generally not given old malt. There was, in the year and a half I was brewing there, like there was literally one incident with old malt that we got delivered, and it was the German stuff. And we literally just contacted them and said, hey, you sent us old malt, take it back, we're not paying for it. And they did, so it was fine. Yeah, but the rest of the stuff we were getting was usually like crushed within a month or two of receiving it. So I don't think it was a really big deal.
Okay, so we talked about malt, we talked about the yeast.
I'll go back to your lagers, because I think one thing people don't realize is you guys are probably the biggest lager brewery in New Zealand, I'd imagine, in terms of, at the end of the day, in terms of, proper, cold ferment lagers. I mean, you got any good tips for people wanting to make lagers? Because you guys make some crackers.
Yes, I can talk about lagers until the cows come home because I love them.
You want to? Okay, cool. You want to talk? That's great. So if you had to make them all day, you had enough.
Oh, what do you want to know? Traditional or New World styles? I mean, lager yeast isn't really any different than ale yeast to use. Even the whole bottom fermenting thing, it's a bunch of bullshit. Like yeast is all mixed through the column of wort, no matter if it's ale or lager. Bottom cropping, bottom fermenting all came because lager yeast doesn't have the same development of flocculation genes, so it doesn't tend to top crop. It doesn't form as heady a foam on the actual ferment. Your krausen is a lot less, but it's it's not some sort of thing where lager yeast is sticking at the bottom and ale yeast is sticking at the top. That's all bullshit. And but anyway, lager yeast is delightful to use and highly worth brewing beers with. And I mean, in my opinion, you can also brew really good hoppy pale ales with lager yeast, depending on what you want to make. But yeah, I would say the main thing with that is fermentation control. And the reason I say that is uncontrolled lager ferments, you tend to get like a dominance of isoamyl acetate or banana ester, which for me is pretty unpalatable in lagers, except for, obviously Export Gold and all other DV products. But that's they can do them. That's cool.
I mean, lovely little Belgian ales, don't they?
Yeah, I'm not their technical manager, that's for sure. But yeah, so yeah, what do you guys want to know? Sorry, I have a lot of thoughts about lager brewing, but yeah, in my opinion, it can only be done truly with obviously lager yeast. I think if you ever do blind tastings of the same recipe made with lager and ale yeast, it's really clear that there's a certain texture and mouthfeel that you can't get with ale yeast, that you can only get with lagers. I mean, any of you guys who participated in the doctor competition a few years ago that we hosted with you guys would probably certainly agree that lager fermentation makes that beer. Otherwise, it would be some sort of slightly odd robust porter. And with lager yeast, all of a sudden, it's like this uber smashable 6.5% dark thing, which doesn't quite fit any style guidelines, which is really cool. Yeah. So
Scott, how do you differentiate, in your opinion, between a lager and a pils? As far as you.
Yeah, I mean, this probably then leads to another discussion about styles and style guidelines. I'm sort of torn. Firstly, about styles, I'm torn between wanting to fit things in categories and then also not wanting to fit things in categories. So, yeah, what can I say? I would say traditionally a Pilsner is a lager beer style, which tends to be hoppy. But then your breadth of hoppiness obviously varies hugely. So, Czech Pilsner and German Pilsner can be completely different beasts as well, even though they're both relatively hoppy. I think the point and counterpoint in a Pilsner is, unlike in international style lagers where you're balancing it with dryness, in those style Pilsners, you're balancing it with hops, bitterness particularly. I mean, not necessarily overt hopping rates either. Like a lot of traditional German styles are not using that much total weight of hop as what we would use anyway. And yet the beers still come out as quite hoppy. So it's kind of also a bit of a difference between the hops like the varieties themselves as well. But I mean, obviously we also have New Zealand Pilsner, which is its own thing again, which is a bit more muddly because it's not necessarily a lager style and brewed with New Zealand ingredients. So it's quite different than German Pilsner styles. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely no Gordon Strong, and I also am not anymore the biggest on putting things into categories, but I would say it's a hoppy lager, yes. Sorry, I had a question about pressure fermenting, which I saw pop up, but I didn't actually see the whole question.
Do you have any thoughts on pressure fermentation supposed to be good for lagers? So fermenting under pressure.
Yeah, I'm very familiar. So here's the story for you. In the early days of our new site at Sawmill, back in 2015 or 16 or whenever that was, we weren't needing to brew enough beer to fully fill our 5,000 liter tanks. So we were filling them half full. And particularly ales and lagers were having greater than expected ester profiles. And so, believe it or not, one of the things you can do to suppress esters is pressure ferment. So you can do it for sure. And basically what fermenting under pressure will do is it will decrease ester profiles. So it depends what you want. If you want a really crisp and clean lager and you want to ferment it relatively warm, definitely ferment it under pressure. Because the luxury that we have as commercial brewers that you guys don't have is that I mentioned before about how our 10,000 liter tanks are really great at fermenting lagers. Well, the reason is that you have 5 meters of hydrostatic pressure pushing down on the yeast. And so you get a lot of suppression of ester profile, which is why they're awesome for lagers, because basically they stress the yeast enough that they actually produce less esters. And so basically we get cleaner lagers out of them, believe it or not, which is pretty cool. And so basically by pressure fermenting, you're mimicking the same process. Now, esters are one thing, but the other big thing about lagers is obviously sulfur metabolism. And this is where I would say I wouldn't pressure ferment, because sulfur metabolism, basically it's going to happen. Wheat beer strains, Belgian beer strains, lager yeasts, they all produce heaps of sulfur during ferment. It can be sulfate, it can be sulfide. It's all not necessarily something you want a heap of in your final beer. Now, in my opinion, you want that stuff to get out of the beer. And so if you're capping your ferments and pressure fermenting, you're not necessarily off-gassing a lot of those sulfur compounds. So while you'll decrease ester profile, you'll also risk increasing sulfur. So I mean, in my opinion, you can decrease ester profile by fermenting at the correct temperature, cold, and then just off-gas all the sulfur and wait till the end of ferment, and then you can cap it if you'd like. That's what I would say.
Oxygenation rate on pitch has a massive impact on ester production too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, and pitch rate and stuff like that as well, for sure.
But no, just oxygenation was one of the big things. I mean, you guys oxygenate a lot anyway, but for home brewers, you're doing lagers, I'd oxygenate maybe twice what you would normally.
Yeah, our standard oxygenation rate for everything is higher than what you can achieve with atmospheric air. So we sort of like, so that the rule of thumb is like sort of 8 ppm for some things, but we'd be doing 12 to 14 for most things, because it's fine. Like it's plenty. We brew a lot of lagers, so we tend to sort of set and forget it at something around there. Yeah, which obviously we're injecting direct O2. But yeah, I mean, look, when you start looking into it as well, yeah, there's a huge amount, like wort composition actually makes a huge difference for ester profiles too. Do we use a D-rest? Yep, absolutely. So here's another golden nugget for you guys, which took me a few years in the game to learn, and it's given to you for free. Enjoy. The majority of your ester profile in beers is created within the first 30% of attenuation, because ester production is usually done using simple sugars, which usually are sort of completely done with first. Basically, yeast will selectively consume sugars based on how easy they are to consume. So the simple sugars go first, and then more complicated and so on until they can't consume anything anymore. And so basically, if you're concerned about getting an atypical ester profile, pretty much anything past 35 to 40% apparent attenuation, you can rise that temperature to whatever you want. Well, within reason, and it shouldn't affect your finished ester profile. So we tend to free rise anywhere between 35 to 45% apparent attenuation, depending on the beer. If it's really high gravity, I tend to hold it off a bit longer just because I'm afraid. But
what sort of percentage throw are you talking about?
So do you guys use like apparent attenuation? Like how far?
Okay, so let's do a simple case of beer that starts at 1050 and finishes at 1010.
Okay, so that's very easy. Thank you. So it's apparent to the gravity of water. So that's why it's apparent, not absolute. But so basically you're assuming that 100% attenuation would be for it to ferment all the way to 1.000. Yep, everyone with me? Yep. Okay, so 1010 would be 20% of the total possible fermentables left. So you take that away from 100%, and that's 80% attenuated.
So at what stage would you start your de-rest then?
So so it's in 5. So 35% would be give me a second.
118, 119. Yeah.
Yeah.
Be going for that.
No. It's much higher than that.
Is it?
Because it would only be
1030 or something, eh?
I think about 1.035 or something.
Yeah, it would be somewhere around there.
Are you talking in terms of relative?
1.030. Yeah.
So on a normal sort of, if you're expecting a 5-day ferment, you'd be on day 4 sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I guess we have the luxury of like being able to sample without compromising the batches. So we're sampling every day, obviously, for gravities. So basically,
some of our people here do that anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we would do it anywhere between. Yeah. So it would be, sorry. So 45% would be. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, we would basically aim for around that for a free rise to, whatever it can get to, really. I mean, even this time of year, lagers don't get anything past sort of 15 if they've been fermenting at 10 for us.
Right.
Yeah, and there's two trains of thought on that. One is the scientist part of my brain, which says it's not making any more esters. The other part of me is like some sort of strange German man who says, no, Scott, you must ferment it cold all the way. And so I've talked to German brewers about that mentality, and the way they would see it is that getting your lager too warm is, in a sense, force aging it or prematurely aging it. They're like, it shouldn't get that warm because it's never going to get that warm. You just ferment it at 10 degrees and eventually you chill it slowly. And then it will stay at that temperature until it's drunk, and then people will be happy. And so they would see that as prematurely force aging your beer by allowing it to get that warm, which is fairly de rigueur, believe it or not. Like that's I don't.
Most of the German brewers still sort of follow Nazis, do they? Or
sorry, say again.
Most of the German brewers, are they still following Nazis? Okay. He was that brewing scientist that you talk about in terms of did all the original cold fermentation shit.
Well, the chap that I talked to about it was he'd just studied at the VLB in Berlin, and his feelings was that was what they were teaching now. Cool. And he's an Italian craft brewer, so but I'm quite confident in his retelling of it. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Do they do a diacetyl rest at all then on the pills?
Not as what I've just been discussing. No,
Okay.
no. They might get it up to 12 degrees or something, but that's about it. Yeah. I mean, there's breweries and there's a sort of a lager only brewery quite close to where I was living in the UK called Braybrook, and they were doing things very much the German way. In that sense, exactly, like they weren't really doing a specific diacetyl rest. It would basically just take whatever it took. But then they also weren't doing diacetyl forcing tests. So, you know, every now and then they would definitely still have diacetyl as well.
How long's a typical lager ferment in your brewery on something, say like, Pilsner?
Shit, well, I've got a particularly hearty culture of German lager yeast on the go, so much that I was slightly afraid it might be cross-contaminated with ale yeast, but it's not. But at the moment, it's taken about 7 days for full attenuation.
Wow,
and then obviously a period of lagering as well. Yeah. So like, yeah, they're ripping through at the moment, and it's not temperature. Is there an advantage to free rise versus specific temperature for the rest? Yes, there is. I would say that yeast at the end of fermentation wants to get warmer, not colder, because all of its metabolic processes, they're slowing down. And if your cooling flicks in, then yeah, you run the risk of basically, especially if you have a particularly flocculent yeast like an ale yeast that you're using, they can flock out really early and just completely drop. And I mean, infamous ones are like the Fuller's strain, like Weiss 1968 or yeah, that strain. Literally, if you anywhere near the end of ferment, if that thing gets the slight hint of chilling, it flocculates, sets like a blanket. Even though it might not be fully attenuated and you might still have simple sugars in the wort, it will do that. So like, in my opinion, free rise is the best because you're not worried about what the yeast is going to do because it's already produced all of its esters that it's going to produce. That part of the fermentation is done. You're merely attenuating. And yeah, I think that's a way better way to go. Whereas if you do it by steps, you are still restricting it, which I don't like to do at that part of the fermentation myself. Like it to do whatever it wants to do until it attenuates all the way out. Because otherwise I'm, worried as a commercial brewer that you might have like re-fermentation issues or something like that if you haven't done the full job.
Like normally at the end of fermentation, I normally add a bit of heat to get them up to de-rest. Do you do anything like that, or you just sort of focus on the atmospheric temperature to get, like when you mention free rise, are you adding temperature or just the atmospheric temperature?
No, we can only cool. We can't actually warm anything. But to be fair, like we have much larger fermentation mass, so like warming happens. It happens no matter what we do if we don't have chilling on, basically. Yeah. What's everyone drinking anyway? Anyone got anything good?
Yeah, it's working our way through them. Just correct the 24.
Bit of a
2-4, yeah. Rewalk it.
vintage Weizenbock.
Oh,
Not too
nice.
bad.
I'm saving that one. I'm not going to go too into that. It might not last.
I was going to finish on that. See, John, you've got the mango.
Yeah, mango and peach sour.
Oh,
So
nice.
how was the sour done, Scott? Kettle sour?
Those beers are kettle soured. Yeah. Lactic culture, basically. Lactobacillus plantarum single strain is my favorite. It's very clean and very fast. And then yeah, boiled, fermented with 001 and yeah.
So you're doing a kettle sour, but with that strain.
Yeah, I mean I propagate it, surprisingly enough. I basically use trying to remember the brand, but Health Post, maybe Health Post Plus's irritable bowel support.
Posty Plus is plus size braziers. Something else.
We use some of those.
What was it used?
How did you know our secret ingredient?
That's the filtering method.
Yeah, well, hey, we have a centrifuge now, so no filtration.
Ooh.
So how long is it souring in the kettle then?
How's that, sorry?
You're souring in the kettle initially, or? So that ties up a kettle for a day and a half or something.
If you have a really good culture of lacto, it's done overnight.
Right.
So with your cultural lacto, you're propagating, you're building that up. You're running like a continuous, like a continuous propagation of that, or are you actually doing it per batch?
Currently, I'm trying to keep one running. Yeah, basically like along the lines of a sourdough mother. But I mean, it turns out to not be as easy as I thought. We had a sort of a wild caught one, which started to go weird and more aggressive than I like, I would say. Not just in lactic acid production, but like other weird
Socks.
Yeah, socks and garbage and other strange things, which sadly had to be dumped. But yeah, so I'm sort of back onto a rolling culture of the plantarum now, which is holding up. It's held up for 2 or 3 batches now. I mean, we're brewing decent sized batches of it, so it's like we're not brewing it often enough that it's really easy to keep going. So basically, I've got like a sealed purged vessel of it in the chiller, and I pull it out before using it, sort of a week in advance or something like that, and I'll dump off the supernatant and then top it up with fresh wort, unhopped fresh wort, and then assess it. I'll assess it for flavor and aroma, sort of 2 days out from brewing.
Sorry, so you dumped off what?
Oh, like basically during the time in the chiller, you sort of, the lactose cells will drop to the bottom. Like you'll get not exactly like a yeast slurry, but you'll get a slurry out of it. So you dump off the stuff on the top and then bring it back out, top it up with some fresh wort, CO2 purge it, get it hot, all the sort of things that lacto likes. And then like a couple of days out from brewing, I'll then basically taste it and see if it's soured, and if it smells and tastes great, then it gets used. If it doesn't, then I quickly grow something else up.
And then you then scale that up again, do you?
Yeah. So then basically what we would do, if it's awesome, we use it, and then before boiling the kettle sour wort, we would just pull a bucket off again.
But you wouldn't need anywhere near the pitching rate of the yeast going into your batches for the kettle stuff, would you?
Yeah, it's insane how little starter of lacto you need. Like it's properly crazy. As long as it's really active, we can pitch like a 20-liter starter of lacto in a 25 hectoliter, like 2,500 liter batch, and it will sour it in like 16 hours.
And your pH goes from what to what? 5.5 to 3.2 or 3.5 or something? Or?
Yeah, somewhere in that range. I mean, it's less about a target pH and just making sure that the flavor and aroma is nice. I mean, it really depends on we tend to fruit all of ours because that style of souring is very simple, obviously, and, relatively boring, which is perfectly fine for some types of beer. But yeah, it pairs best with heavy flavorings, in my opinion, like fruits and spices and stuff like that. We'd be targeting anywhere between, I personally target 3.2, 3.3 pH.
And what are you doing for your fruit additions there? What form is the fruit coming in?
Aseptic puree and fermenter, basically.
When you're adding your fruit, how far through to the end are you adding it?
Basically what we would add for a dry hop, so sort of like a few points out from terminal, something like that. Yeah. Obviously, you want to retain as much fresh aromatics as you can, but you want to make sure it still ferments out and is a safe product. Yeah,
When it goes in the can. Yeah.
There's some dodgy products out there, that's for sure. There's a whole bunch of people in the UK making the same things in the States, where they're basically back sweetening with fruit juices and then packaging and then selling it and telling people to keep it cold. And
I was gonna say, we're gonna see any of those post-fermentation fruited ales from Sawmill, or
Nope. No. Well, not no, not unless I pull like not unless I pull a north end and bottle re-ferment with some pear juice or something like that,
Deep Creek is sending these down to be steamed to be pasteurized.
Well, respect to them for at least doing it well, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do it,
sorry.
Oh, if you're going to do it safely, right?
You mentioned
Yeah.
before you've got a recent centrifuge in the mix.
Yeah, it's not so recent for the business, but it's pretty recent for me.
Right.
Yeah, it was bloody awesome, mate. So basically, for you nerds out there, again, all settling in beer is sort of like, we use this law called Stokes' law, which sort of determines settling rate of spherical particles in a medium of density X. And all a centrifuge does is increase the gravitational coefficient. So basically it just settles things out really fucking fast. It's pretty awesome, actually. And it's not a filter, which is quite nice. So you still do get you definitely still get protein and stuff through it. But it's also really adjustable. So you can basically, well, this is a big thing that I've been trying to do recently, is trying to work out what settings on the centrifuge correspond to which things actually come through, I guess. So we run everything through the centrifuge, including hazies, which actually anyone who's got the Rewalker will notice it's actually not that hazy. It looked like that in the fermenter, my bad. Which is an interesting other story. But yeah, so you can sort of selectively choose how much material to send through, because it's doing it by basically centrifugal force. You can adjust the centrifugal force by how fast it spins, and then also how fast its throughput is. So yeah, it's quite cool. It's quite, quite
So
nerdy.
you're centrifuging the finished beer?
Yeah, post ferment. So it's been lagering or sitting around cold in fermenter. So in between bright beer tank and fermenter, we'll centrifuge it.
Okay, so the stuff you don't keep, what do you do with that?
You mean like the tank bottoms, or?
Well, that doesn't. So you centrifuges are different densities, and so the stuff that there's some like a stream that comes out that you don't want.
Yep, relatively little. You basically have like it's kind of complex, but also kind of simple. You have basically discharge. So all the solid material is getting spun to the very outsides of the centrifuge plates, and there's an opening there which will periodically set on a timer or on a like a haze percentage coming out of the centrifuge. Will open up the plates and it will discharge whatever solid material there is down the drain, basically. So you can, it depends on how you want to run the machine, really. Like we just tend to have it set on a timer. So if we're trying to make clear beer, every 4 minutes, it'll discharge solid material. Because basically the more, no worries, Rex, thanks. Basically the more solid material it builds up in the centrifuge without it dumping that material will then increase the total amount that's going out the centrifuge as well. Hopefully that has explained the situation and not confused things more.
How do you find it compared to filtering at the end of the day? Is it kind of like, just different, better, worse, different kind of characteristics?
My personal opinion, there are some things that I kind of like having filtered, but the centrifuge is very consistent, which is awesome. Like, when you start it up, it's going to take this long and we can separate out these particle sizes, and it will kind of do that every time. Whereas filtering can be a bit of a black art in that, like, the beer can look completely clear coming out of fermenter. So you think, great, this is going to run through the filters super easy. And then it doesn't, because there are obviously more things that are blocking those filters than necessarily what you can see with the visible eye. So, but I mean, that being said, I still think like the sparkle you can get in, like, simple table lagers and pilsners and stuff like that, like where the other thing too is filters are actually removing things, whereas centrifuging is you're separating things, but there's still plenty of stuff that gets through as well. That's why you tend to have like through centrifuges, unless you're fining, you tend to have way more issues with, I mean, it only matters if you actually care about it as a brewery, but you have like less chill haze stability, because all your chill haze material still gets through. You've got less protein stability, because over time those proteins start precipitating and stuff like that. So like in the past, you guys probably would have found that Sawmill beer is like clear as until its best before date. And that was because we were filtering down to like 3 micron or 1 micron, like it was really tight.
Biggest thing I noticed in the XPA today, like it's normally that beer is just, you know, tight as that. It has got a really quite a distinct opacity to it. I mean, it's clear, but it's not. I mean, man, that used to be bright, like polished.
Yeah. And I agree. Like in some beers, I would still probably not mind a bit of polishing filter, but it's at the moment it's tricky because we've transitioned fully to it. So it would be quite hard to start bringing back in bits. I mean, stuff like lagers.
I got the new toy. You got to use it.
Yeah. Well, that's also it too. Like it's I'm sure it's paid for itself already, but yeah, it's an interesting one that as well. Like I prefer it personally because I like some beers to actually be quite crystal clear, and I like to be able to choose which ones are and aren't. But when you have a centrifuge, that's the other thing too, is we're now not using finings at all, pretty much. Like we're using a little bit of kettle fining, but that's about it. We could probably make more of an effort towards finding proteins and polyphenols out of the beer, which would probably decrease haze development in package as well.
In the kettle?
No, cold side. Nah, so you've got like, you can use like silica sols, really good for, Biofine Clear, I think it's called, the common one for homebrewers, which is like basically colloidal silica, and that's really good at removing protein. Yeah, it's probably the big one. I mean, you can use PVPP and stuff like that for finding out polyphenols, but we wouldn't touch that shit.
Yeah. Can you use that with a centrifuge? Don't you have to filter that shit out?
Yeah, and that too. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't use it anyway. So
Pretty nasty stuff.
But because I mean,
Robert would be happy with that.
Yeah, unfortunately, the thing with PVPP is it's literally the only thing that does that job, which is why anyone who's running DE filter is probably running some PVPP in there. So steam products, I would say, probably a little bit of PVPP in the filter. Anyway, for you,
What's that?
for you guys who don't know, yeah,
PVPP?
sorry, I'll explain. It's an acronym for a compound called polyvinyl pyrimidone, something like that. Anyway, it's basically a form of plastic, and it's a finding agent traditionally used specifically for hop polyphenols, and it's very effective at that. It's outrageously effective. So like if you have like a massive dry hopping load or something like that, and something tastes really green and really tannic, that will strip it all out. But it's traditionally used in diatomaceous earth filters. You would blend it in with a bit of the diatomaceous earth powder, because it's sort of a powder itself. Yeah, you would blend it in at the same time as you're setting your filter beds on one of those. But yeah,
You don't use it in home brewing at all because you've got to filter it out because you don't want to ingest that shit.
No, it's literally microplastics, which are gonna sadly be the bane of our generations, relatively speaking. Yeah.
Oh, that's the stuff that the Germans were using, and they weren't getting it completely out. It was the whole population was scared shitless suddenly. Plastic in your beer, all that shit.
It's one of those weird ones that the Germans can probably use it because it probably technically counts as a processing aid,
not
as an actual ingredient, so it's okay. But yeah, if it was getting through, then that would have been a huge fury, I would have no doubt.
Yeah, it qualifies for behind because it's non-soluble or something. It's stupid, eh?
It's basically a plastic that had a charge on it and would bind it with all the proteins and stuff, and they would take it back in.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And usually the Germans would call D like Kieselguhr, so they'd usually be like trying to filter it out with Kieselguhr, but then that's just a particulate filter itself, so like stuff can still get through it basically.
But Kieselguhr is diatomaceous earth.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, which doesn't exclude PVPP from passing through it basically, because it's like any particulate filter. There's a pathway through eventually. But yeah, it's not something that I would use anyway. But I mean, yeah, I think it's very untrendy to use nowadays anyway, because I mean, we live in the land of hazies now, which is great. So how many of you home brewers are commonly brewing hazy IPAs?
5.
Not me.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
Hef,
brew must
he,
be a few.
he brews a few.
Done 2 so far this year. Running out of time for a third.
I don't know, mate. Turn around in 9 days, eh? Sweet. Yeah, they're a bit of a thing, aren't they? Like it was pretty mad in the UK while I was over there, and obviously it's pretty much the same in New Zealand as when I left. But
I'm surprised it was so big in the UK.
say again, sorry.
I'm surprised it was so big in the UK.
Well, I'm happy to talk briefly about the UK craft beer scene, which is kind of a fascinating thing in its own right. Obviously, the England and the UK has a much greater native beer culture than we do here.
And also
So-
the real beer sort of scene, which I
Yeah, well, there are literally styles of beer invented in the UK. You know, they have a huge tradition of cask beer, of porters, you know, imperial stouts. I mean, that's where that stuff's all from. And so the interesting part of that is, in my opinion, like craft beer has been quite slow there. So I would say they certainly have been operating years behind New Zealand. Like they're getting into things that we were into in New Zealand in 2017 and 2018, you know. So like it's a quite an immature scene, but it's probably maturing a lot more rapid than here. So they're, I think, also probably closer proximity to the States. Like it's a little bit easier for them to get to the Eastern Seaboard as well. But it's really interesting. So what you basically have in the UK is you sort of have macro beer, which is massive. And then you have cask beer, which is also really quite big. Also dominated by way shorter shelf life. And there's a general culture in cask beer that it should be cheap. So unfortunately, Camera, bless them, they're a blessing and a curse on themselves. They have sort of consigned cask beer as permanently being the cheap option. And a lot of the people who drink it and are advocates for it are also advocates for it being cheap. So it's really
so
hard.
what's the pound per pint price at the moment then?
So if you drink in a country pub, you are paying like £3.20 a pint.
Yes. Hasn't changed much.
Yeah. Like it depends where you drink, obviously. If you're drinking some shitty bar like Weatherspoons, it's still £2 a pint. But
£2 a pint.
oh yeah, you can get Sharp's Doom Bar, that's now owned by Molson Coors. This gives you an idea, and that sells for £2 a pint. And you can get
what's the parity with $1 now? 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, is it?
I think we've got slightly up now. Like I think it might be like 1.9 to 1 or something like that. But
see, Reese's eyes are just lighting up at $4.
Oh, I'm just trying to work it out. This seems
basically just double it. I mean, you get close enough. But like for instance, like at a Weatherspoons, you could buy a pint of Brewdog Punk IPA for £3.
it's not a real pint though.
It's
It's a full, not 600 mils instead of 500 mils and everything.
Yep. It's a great place to be drinking. That's for sure. I mean, even craft bars, you would be charged. I mean, it's much more expensive, which is why there's a bit of pushback against craft, is because when you're paying £3 a pint for a cask beer, why would you pay £5.50 a pint for a craft beer? Which is unfortunately the quality value thing is sort of having a bit of an issue over there. So that's why people are segregating themselves sort of into groups a bit more. But yeah, I mean, you might still pay like, I don't know, the brewery I was working for, we were charging £4 to £4.50 a pint of craft beer at our own tap room. And that was I mean, we were in like a rural village, so well, I mean, a small rural village of 20,000 people, but like that was probably as much as you could charge in that village, but on the grand scheme of things, it was still fairly cheap, for sure. I mean, we were charging maybe £5 for a imperial pint of West Coast IPA, you know, which is a very dangerous proposition, by the way.
Yeah.
When
Anyway.
I was a student, I can remember getting a pint of bitter for 40p. So that's like
That was a long time ago, John.
Well,
Was that
not
before or
that
after the
old.
war?
But yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, like cask is definitely, it plays that game where it's first to the bottom on price. And unfortunately, like Camera, again, bless them, like they've done an amazing thing in reviving interest in traditional styles, which is, for me as an outsider, is absolutely amazing, because otherwise they would be dead, I have no doubt. But unfortunately, they have tied in the entire family of dispense with they've tied in dispense with, so cask is good, and then cask is also cheap. So unfortunately, at no point in the narrative has ever swung around to quality. And so like Camera beer festivals are something else. Like they are a hell of a
Piss face, are they?
No. Quite
So I mean,
unique.
like, Camera beer festivals, it's basically like 400 casks on a bar, volunteers running the bar. Each pint costs £2.70. You paid £3 to get in, and they're all gravity casks. So if you go on the first day, they're amazing. If you go on the third day, they're absolutely dog shit.
Right.
And yeah, and that's what it is. And you know, no one cares really. Like people that go on the third day are still equally as happy as people that go on the first. And that's because the narrative is actually around not actual beer quality. It's around,
It's in a cask.
yeah, which is interesting. And then
Yeah,
there's
so at the end of the day, it's all more about the romance of the whole image and feel of beer rather than the beer quality itself these days.
well, and so the fascinating, this is also, for me, it was pretty humorous, but obviously wanting to embrace the modern times, they also reluctantly, at one of the ones I went to, they reluctantly put on like a keg beer bar. And unfortunately in the UK, everyone packages their keg beer in one-way kegs and plastic PET kegs, called key kegs. And rather than admit that they were regular kegs, they actually labeled that bar as key cask bar. So it wasn't a cask bar, it wasn't a keg bar, it was a key cask bar, because they couldn't bring themselves to actually admit that they were serving kegs. Which yeah, again, it seems like a simple thing, but yeah, it was pretty funny from the outside anyway. Right, I'm gonna have to tap out for 1 second and take a leak, and then I'll be back, guys.
Cheers, Scott.
I think it's just if you got technical brewing questions, ask Scott. He really, really knows his shit. And two, he shares a lot. He's one guy I've learned masses off. So if you've got sort of like, you know, he's one that Kelly's really technical. Scott's got this kind of nice sort of a bit more of this artistic balance to him that I think is quite good. But and he's got the ability to really translate things down to a homebrew level. So, you know, he's the one guy, if you get a chance to sit down and just pick his brains, man.
I mean, the beers tonight, the beers have been fantastic. You know, they've got a really nice balance. They're not
What have you had,
overly-
William?
So I decided to get that 6-box. So I started on the Pilsner. That Pilsner definitely got my tongue straight away. That was beautiful, actually.
I got a funny bit of asparagus in the first bit of that of me.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a bit of that sulfy area kind of thing, but that's always been there. I wanted to chat to him about the water profile and the pale.
Oh, that's what I meant to talk about next, was water. That's what we've not touched on.
The Weizenbock. What do you think, Kelly? I think the Weizenbock.
You guys have peaked too early.
Yeah.
No, mate. I've just got like about 4 half-filled glasses in front of me, and I just kind of dance between them. It's easier that way.
Oh, now we know your secret, David.
It wasn't Bock.
Weizenbock's just like, you put a little bit into rinse your glass and you go, ooh, I'm going to look forward to this puppy.
Yeah. I'm having the old abandoned double XPA now, which I probably should have done in the reverse order, but anyway.
I want to ask about one thing I think Sawmill do incredibly well is what they do with Rewalker. Like who's got the 24, the Sawmill? Yeah, you know how Rewalker's normally sort of quite mineral and got that real sort of typical kind of I call it like a flinty kind of bite to it, as well as a little bit of pine. Sawmill consistently seem to pull so much fruit out of Rewalker. I'm really curious as a hot sauce batch. I know the Clayton Rewalker is a lot more fruit forward, but they just get these beautiful. You're back. I was going to ask you about your number 24, your hazy Rewalker. One thing I've always noticed is you manage to coax beautiful flavors out of Rewalker as a brewery. Like it's not just that whole mineral kind of flinty Rewalker diesely kind of dominated. You get this there's so little kind of minerality in that beer. You coax with that lovely fruit character that you get out of Rewalker.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's a really, like, when used well, it's a really beautiful hop. And equally, like as you say, it can be really kind of diesely and stuff as well.
I like them both ways. I just fascinated.
Yeah. There are two parts to the answer. One part is that we didn't expect it to be quite that awesome, and we were pleasantly surprised by that was all one base. It was actually 2 farms worth of Rewalker from New Zealand hops, and we were so impressed. We actually went back to the farms and said, "Look, guys, like, what did you do here? This stuff is fucking awesome." Which is really cool because we'll sort of probably be looking into working with maybe more closely with those farmers for the next season's crop, because we're actually surprisingly one of the biggest users of Rewalker domestically. But
I would have thought that would have been Emerson's with their initial things with Rewalker and their original NZ Pilsner.
Yeah, I guess one of the.
I think they might have changed.
Sorry. One of the biggest craft breweries.
Yeah. But even Emerson's, they had to rework, because for them it's all about continuity of supply and consistency, and that's been one of their big things over the last 4 or 5 years, is reworking all their recipes to use tint hops as tint hops rather than base hops, because they just can't, for the scale they're doing, they can't get continuity of supply.
Yeah, no, exactly, and that's the big problem, is that, like, particularly with New Zealand hops as a co-op, they're pulling crop off of 20 different farmers, 10 or 15 of which might grow Rewalker. So, like, it's actually a consistency and continuity problem with your product, which is something that actually, like, New Zealand hops has been impressively good at starting to open up about. So we now have more opportunity than ever before to actually start working directly with farmers and to get directly what we want in profiles and hops, which is really cool. This last season, we've had a lot of selection from our suppliers. We use New Zealand hops and Clayton hops, and we've had a lot of possibility to actually do direct selections, if not on cone hops, but then also on pellets. And moving forward, our volumes are only increasing. So yeah, we have probably even more selection opportunities again, and they're all really excited for our business. So we have, like, really quite amazingly awesome buying power now. So we can actually start to do a lot of individual selections, which is bloody amazing. Like, it's really, really nice. It's nice to have that control. I mean, I was quite surprised coming back to the country to find out that Sawmill's volume in terms of our New Zealand hop usage is literally, for both hop producers that we use, they're nearly their biggest craft customers. So conveniently,
you guys produce a shitload of beer, though. I mean, that's one thing I will say. I think that Sawmill is like the quiet performer that doesn't necessarily, you don't blow your own trumpet, you don't get out there and rah, but man, you guys crank out a lot of damn good beer.
Yeah, I would certainly say that for our size in New Zealand as well, we're using a really high proportion of New Zealand ingredients, whereas it tends to be like people who are doing similar volumes, you know, the likes of like Behemoth, or I think Liberty is probably slightly greater than us, they would tend to be using a higher proportion of imported ingredients like American hops and stuff. So I think we're sort of proportionally ahead on that, which is really cool actually. Like, and honestly, there's some great hops being brought out. Like Nectaron is brand new to me since being back in the country, and it's fucking great. I've started bringing it into actually our core range IPA, and it's playing really, really nicely alongside a little bit of Citra that we've got in there already. And actually a little bit of Galaxy as well. It's sort of evolving that beer as well. Yeah, are you guys interested in hearing about where we go as a commercial brewery? I mean, I've been brought back in this role that I'm in to sort of make the beers as good as they can be, basically, which is a really quite a delightful blank check. And so one of the things I've been doing is basically working back through core range, and you know, the first thing I tend to draw my mind to technically is process, and then you go to ingredients and start working your way back into sort of the base profile of what you want things to be, which has been really exciting to be able to sort of come back on the scene and go, okay, like these are things I like, these are things I like less, and so on, and work on with them.
Who are you bouncing that off, Scott? How do you do the self checks?
Yeah, well, and you're absolutely right. Like, it's probably a really good thing that I don't have like complete carte blanche, because otherwise, you know, there'd be like some pretty weird things going on. But yeah, conveniently we have the brewery manager is a guy called Rory, whose background is he was actually hilariously at the same time as I was overseas. He was overseas in London, brewing for Four Pure, which is a big old lion-owned craft brewery in London. And he's like the brewery manager, and he's got a lot of background in engineering. He's a process engineer by trade, but he's also got a lot of tasting knowledge behind him. He's worked in dairy factories and stuff before, as well as obviously in brewing. So he's actually got like heaps of sensory tasting background. He loves beer. So between him, myself, our lead brewer Paul, who's ex-independent, ex-Lion, now thankfully ours, and obviously Mike, the owner, like between the sort of four of us, well, five of us, even our brewer Masashi generally joins in on these sessions as well. We basically, I propose ideas, then sometimes we try them. And then when we do, we basically taste them off together and say, you know, is it better? Is it worse? Is it the same? Was the change pointless? Was the change worthwhile?
So are you doing this on a smaller plant then, or how are you doing these micro changes?
Well, you know, the beautiful thing about small changes is that they're very incremental and very hard to detect, generally speaking. So no, full risk. But which is occasionally quite scary, but thankfully I've been doing it for a while, so it's not as scary as you'd think.
So, so you're putting stuff out of a bank of previous brews to compare with then, or what?
Yeah,
or just memory.
We're busy enough that we're packaging any individual core range beer as being packaged once to twice within any 1 month period. So you've always got something within that month to compare it off to, basically. But I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily, I mean, I'm very sure I can speak about this. Thankfully, my employers are quite confident in my, you know, ability to communicate, you know, adequately with people, and they don't really care.
Well, Mike's probably out surfing, so, you know, I know it's nighttime.
Yeah. Well, I've actually just taken up paddleboarding, which is awesome. But yeah, no, absolutely. No, I mean, it's, you know, I'm very thankful in that, like, there's no secrets insofar as anything. So by the way, if any of you are drinking any of our beers and you're interested in how we do something, give me a yell. I can literally tell you what's in it or what we do to make it, because we don't really believe in secrets. There are no secrets amongst brewers. We're all just out to make good beer. And that goes for me commercially. I'm always happy to give people advice if they need it, or take advice as I need it, which no doubt happens as well. But anyway, yes, bringing me back to, have any of you guys noticed any quality issues in American hops recently? Just out of interest. It's not a test, I'm just asking.
Kelly mentioned something about the yields were down and the different flavors or different something between the seasons where he detected differences and the ability to go out there and actually be part of the early harvest and actually pick hops and that sort of thing. But
noticing a bigger difference between those guys that can do selection and those that can't. I think there's almost a bit of a stratification in terms of hop sourcing.
Yeah, so there's several things at play. One of which was a fire in the Yakima Valley pre-harvest last season, which led to, in a certain part of the valley, certain varieties being harvested a lot earlier than they should have been, basically to try to avoid any possibility of smoke taint. So some key varieties were harvested far before physiological ripeness. So alphas were hugely down, oils were hugely down. And honestly, it wasn't a problem in the UK. And I got back here and I saw that some of the hops that we were being sold and the certificates of analysis, and we were literally looking at half the essential oils that we've had in the past, literally half, which is basically your best indicator of aromatic quality. And so obviously you're still paying the same rate for them and you're getting half the amount of potential aroma out of it.
Some nice little vegetal beers out there as a result.
So it's really interesting, and it's been an interesting thing to deal with because it's not easy.
So this is why you're going to head towards more NZ based?
Yep, that's definitely part of it. Like, I feel really confident in what we can get out of New Zealand growers now that we seem to be able to work a lot closer with them than previous. Also, for key American hop varieties, we're looking at going in with other breweries for lot selections. So rather than being like a small fish and all taking our own little bites, we'll collectively be sort of one big fish and have one really good bite of it and actually make a call on stuff based on quality, based on the volume that we're buying. So for lot selection, the minimum order quantity is like 2 tons of a variety. So for instance, 2 tons of Citra or 2 tons of Mosaic, or it might actually be 2.4 now I think about it. But it's a lot basically. And you know, when you're paying $50 to $55 a kilo landed, it's pretty pricey. So that's sort of part of the fun of it being commercial is obviously you want your core range beers to, in some sense, have a similar profile every year on year, while you're dealing with a variable agricultural product. And I mean, I'm sure all of you are super aware of this as well. But yeah,
or you like Behemoth and you just call it a different name every time and then you don't have that issue.
Well, I mean, Andrew is buying so much American hop that he's getting lot selections.
Yeah.
So certainly on Citra and Mosaic. So
are you going to say his beer is going to be more consistent then?
He's had to commission a new brew house and stuff like that too. I mean, you know, that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's tricky and it's actually hugely impacted some of our core range beers in my opinion. So yeah, it's a really difficult one to deal with. I mean, the main one for me is Mosaic. Like, it's just nowhere near as nice as it was 3 years ago, and that's what we're being sold. So yeah, it's so I'm sort of rapidly.
So it's got a bit of a weird candy flossy kind of flavor to it or something at the moment. It's kind of a bit, there's something in it that's just kind of weird.
I think what we're being supplied in New Zealand is also a lot more savory than fruity as well. Like it's it used to be super fruit forward, paired really well with other fruity hops like Citra. And I think what we're getting at the moment tends to be much more on that sulfurous side. It's dank, it's really quite savory, which is not what I want out of it. So yeah, it's all part of the fun and games. So sort of like going through the range and working out what's the best thing to do. And it's something that we do commercially, even when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of liters a year. The same as what you'd be worrying about at home. If you find a batch of your like favorite pale ale recipe with new season hops, it's just not coming out the same. And then you have the question. Sorry.
Just on the whole hop thing, obviously you said you've gone, more New Zealand hops. Have you got a few favorites? And how do you sort of decide whether they're more of a kettle hop, more of a whirlpool, more of a dry hop?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Favorites, like what's tasting amazing in our beers at the moment is Nectron and Rioja. Really impressed with those. Yeah, the quality of what we're getting in terms of those hops is really good. We really like Hort 9909, which was never actually released as a name, but it's actually just been axed. I understand for next season. It's been run out. It's not an IPA hop, so it's not, sadly.
We heard about 101 and 102 recently from Kerry, but we haven't heard that 909.
Yeah. 101 and 102, I'm pretty sure have both been released commercially. I haven't brewed with either since being back, but we're on basically a lineup we can get a hold of 102 at the moment, but not 101. But we'll definitely be playing around with those more in the future as well.
Because the 9909 was just like pure lemonade, like pure citrus.
It's bred from a Hallertau line, so it's bred from a noble hop line, so it's quite it's citrusy, but it's more in the noble sense rather than like citra. You know what I mean? It's like less upfront in your face, but we really like it for like heaps of our lagers. It's actually really pleasant for bittering as well. I mean, not that NZ Hops really liked that when we told them that, but late it's really nice too. Like it's quite like lemony and like sort of light hay, like not unlike some really nice German hops. Which I guess makes sense given it's from, I think,
It sounds like the Sarasi hops, but like that, isn't it?
Say again, sorry.
Sriracha. Yes. Yeah.
Less divisive. Yeah, Sriracha is very like herbal as well.
Oh, okay. So like that, but more lemony.
Yeah, much cleaner. More like sort of somewhere in between lemon drop and mochweka. In a good way.
I don't mind lemon drop. It just always remind me of Sunlight dishwashing liquid for some bloody reason. All those childhood memories. I can never get around it.
Not a good single hop. No one would doubt that for sure. But
any tips for using New Zealand hops? I mean, because that's the other thing that I think you guys are very, very, very good. You don't have a lot of the ribes character that in your beers that you sometimes get with those sort of that. As you flat out would say, that cat piss kind of thing.
I mean, there are two main things at play, I never actually answered your question about Rioja either, which I'm aware of. There are two main things at play. One is where you get the hops from. So it's about like getting them from a grower who really knows what they're doing. And also the other thing, in my opinion, is not adding them very, very late in the ferment. So like you get a lot of undesirable sulfur-based characters, for instance, are quite easily off-gassed. So in my opinion, anything with that sort of character, I would tend to use, if you're using it in a hazy, I would use it for an early dry hop. If you're using it late, then still add it like a few points out from fermentation, allow it to off-gas for a day or something like that before you then cap it. And that seems to be the difference in scrubbing out some of those more undesirable characters in favor of the fruity ones, in my opinion.
It's a good opinion, I think.
Yeah, and that's what I do with stuff like Galaxy, which, look, shit, I used a lot of Galaxy in my time at Good George, and like I have a sort of very dual relationship with that hop, and that it can be amazing, and it can also, to me, smell like extremely sweaty brewer's socks. And so the way that I found to temper it is to make sure you add it with enough fermentation that you're off-gassing some of those sort of weird aromas out of it, but you can still sort of capture that really lovely oil profile. It sounds really counterintuitive, because I mean, traditionally you would say cap the hop in, keep everything. But in my experience, you can still off-gas stuff for a day, even with dry hops in, without actually compromising that much on overall aromatic intensity. But that's something that's totally not really supported by science. It's just more of an anecdotal thing. But I would say that's what we tend to try to do with a lot of our New Zealand hops. Sorry, stuff like Rewalker, like where it can be quite catty and quite ribes-like as well. But I mean, the other thing too is like we have much greater control over selection on that as well, which definitely helps too. So I mean, we're trying to select stuff from people who've been growing it for a long time. So there's like the Oldham's farm in Tapawera, and Mac hops as well, which is sort of just out of Motueka. They've been growing it for ages too, and they're super good at growing it. So like the Rioja IPA that you're having, David, and hopefully enjoying, is mostly hops from Mac hops. Yeah.
I love the hop profile on this. I think it's beautiful. Also love the texture, and like as you say, I mean, like it's hazy but not too hazy. I mean, to me, that's what it kind of should be. It's haze that should be there, not haze that's kind of fought to get in there.
Yeah. So the other big thing, I mean, with hazes that I've been dialing in is I'm trying to get stable haze that's not from yeast, because I don't know if you guys realize this, but like yeast will survive down to pH 2 and your stomach's at pH 3. So if you consume a lot of yeast, it will cause digestive distress at some point, is what it is.
It's a very nice way of describing crop dusting.
Yeah. I was trying to keep it polite, but yeah. And so basically I'm like quite conscious that, you know, the point should not be to create haze from yeast. It should be to create haze from obviously your protein polyphenol interactions and stuff like that. So I'm doing a lot of work now with our basically hazy beers to try to create stable haze that's not from yeast. And I'm sort of doing all the yeast counts in the background to back things up as well. So yeah, so that's quite good fun actually. And so that was the Rioja was the very start of the experiment basically. So that's me
I think the texture on this beer is lovely. I mean, like what you're saying there, I mean, like it sits so well on the palate, and it's got a nice roundness, but it doesn't have a heaviness, and it doesn't get any of that kind of like cloying sick build or the cloying build that you can get on the finish. It actually reminds me of, I mean, like it's kind of got that kind of textural thing that I mind, you know, like things like Heady Topper and some of those real sort of original New England styles that had that richness in that body, but that lightness too, and that sort of zestiness on the palate. It's lovely.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's so from memory, for anyone who's interested, I'm pretty sure that's Lager Light and chit malt, believe it or not. So that was me trying to be sneaky and trying to get protein from chit malt rather than from oats. I'm pretty sure I used chit wheat and chit barley, but there's no oats in that beer. Yeah.
It gives a funny character on the front though. Like the only thing I picked, I was going to ask you about that, whether you used oats on it, because it's got almost like it's a weird kind of, not a green character. It's a funny kind of character from chip beers. You get like it about right in the front of the palate. When oats when we kick some of that sort of slightly dusty, kind of oily thing about just a little bit after, which I didn't get any of that.
Yeah, I didn't go over the top on chip malt on that beer, but I think I have dialed it back since then.
Sorry, I don't know anything about chit malt. What's chit malt?
Basically, chit malt is what the Germans invented to cheat the Reinheitsgebot.
Right.
So it's like, it's malted, but like super, super fast. So it's completely under-modified.
So is it barley though? It's still barley.
You can malt anything to chit specification, basically. So like the chit reference is the little, when you soak it and then you germinate it, the little first sprout that comes out, that's the chit. And normally you would leave it to get a certain length before you would then kiln it. But in chit malt, you basically wait until it's only just emerged, and then you would kiln it very, very lightly, so that, you still have a lot of protein intact. So it's basically like, it's kind of like the cheat Germans' way of using flaked barley or flaked wheat, because they can't use. So
you end up with something which doesn't modify much, but then that becomes part of the mash that you can.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way of introducing unmodified proteins and sugars into your mash, basically.
Right.
You give your beer a really nice body, but without some of the kind of traits that you get from oats or from flavor traits, also from unmalted wheats or flake wheats and things like that. It's pretty cool, but it can have some of it. I quite like it.
Yeah, in higher quantities, it can be like excessively grassy, in my opinion.
I just picked up that little fun of green on it that kind of just made me think. Yeah.
Which I think in that Rewalker I was at 10%, which I think I've since gone down on the overall amount that I would use on that. But it's an interesting one to play with, and it's really good in certainly in lager styles for foam positive proteins. Like it's really good for foam at small percentages, and good for body. I mean, it's good for both foam and body for.
That's actually a good thing for anybody's homebrewing. If you're using carapils and stuff like that, swapping out for a bit of chit can actually be pretty cool, because carapils can get a funny kind of, there's a weird kind of flavor that it gives that I think chit does, especially at low levels.
Yeah, I agree. Cheers, Colin.
I think it's cracking beer, mate. But your Weizenbock.
You're on the Weitze, yeah. Well, obviously one of my old babies, that one. So I was pretty happy to see they were still brewing.
That's yum.
Still tasting all right. Yeah, the last bottle I cracked, it was really coming into its own. I think when I arrived in the country, it was still way too young.
Yeah, so the booze is pretty separate on it, but that's...
Yeah. But it's nice to be able to brew such things as well. Like it's, I was pretty surprised, to be honest, on returning to the country that both the Weizenbock and Rogan beer were still being brewed. So, that's not a terrible legacy by any means.
You were responsible for the Rogan beer too.
Oh yeah. You guys want to hear that? Well, whoever's left.
Yeah, no, tell us the story. It's a great beer.
Well, I was looking for something new to brew, and I was looking through a style guideline, as you do sometimes when you're a nerd and a brewer, and I flicked over the historical section, found Rogan beer, and I was like, shit, that sounds really cool. And then immediately tried to find one to buy in New Zealand in 2016 and was very unsuccessful.
Yeah.
And so I just sort of basically was like, it sounds pretty good though. So really quite like to make one of those. And I had some Weiss beer yeast propagated up for another beer, and I was like, it'd be rude not to use it for something else. And I somehow managed to convince everyone to make one, which was the real feat. And and then I just gave it a crack, really. But it's at least 50% rye.
That was the laughter on that.
It's a fucking bitch. Yeah. It's a sadist experiment, that's for sure. But I enjoyed the first one so much. I was like, wow. And we've consistently managed to make it pretty much at least a batch a year, which has been really cool. So that's an old recipe of mine anyway. But so it's like Cara rye, chocolate rye, rye malt, and then a blend of Vienna and Munich malts, German Vienna and Munichs.
So the conversion process, there's so much rye malt in there. There's enough enzymes in the rest of the malt to convert.
Yeah, it's basically if you're using regular rye malt, it's still got plenty of diastatic power. It's basically like a Dunkelweizen, but with rye, essentially. That's probably the best way to think about it. But it's literally nearly an extinct style. I mean, they used to make it in Germany before the advent of the Reinheitsgebot. And then the Reinheitsgebot basically outlawed the brewing with rye. And so it's been dead until the 20th century. And then a few people in sort of the 1950s started to brew it again. In Bavaria. And randomly I decided to brew in New Zealand. There you go.
Yeah. Pretty cool beer, man.
Yeah.
I love how the heavy yeast just plays with the rye. It just, because rye can be pretty spicy and aggressive on its own. The heavy just kind of softens it, just rounds it, just kind of just,
Honestly, I feel the same. It's my favorite use of that combination of rye and that yeast is just, whereas rye on its own, I'm like sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. I'm not always confident which way it's going to go. But in that beer, it's like basically like banana on like mashed banana on rye bread. Toasted rye bread. It's a good time. Yeah, but then obviously the Weizenbock as well was initially was a collab between myself and Brent from Good George, which we brewed for the first time. Yeah, shit, in like 2016 or 17. I think I've still got the original Excel file on my laptop, to be honest. But yeah, for the recipe. But yeah, it's a good one. It's evolved a little bit throughout the years, and yeah, I'm back on board for the brewing of it next year, so it'll be back fully under my control. But yeah, it's a tasty one, and it's nice to be able to brew some of these weird styles. I mean, I'm still, inherently a lover of classic styles, just for the romance of the I guess the history behind them, and the fact that I'd never tried a whole bunch of them before I brewed them. So yeah, it's a bit of a treat to still be able to have the confidence of the bosses to keep making them. Baltic Porter as well. I mean, it's weird. It's a big old 8% black lager, and yet
The Baltic Porter is exceptional. Still love it.
make it every year.
I still sell it. I think I've still got five generations of it now, because I actually love going back at it. At age as well. I'm going to go back about 4.5, 5 years, and it still drinks good. Quite different, but yeah, it's just yum.
Yeah, I agree. Like it's funny because it hits like sweet spots, like all aging beer, I guess. They're like these funny sweet spots where you're like, that is fucking amazing, and you're like, should I drink everything I've got left, or should I like wait to see what happens next, And that was definitely one of those beers for me. Like the first couple of batches that we made, it went through this weird Black Forest Gâteau sort of thing, where like it was like it sort of went a bit roast and ashy for a bit, and then it popped out of that and got really fruity again. And
Are you storing it cold, or you selling it sort of cellar temp?
anything like that. I mean, just cellar temp, yeah, for sure.
See, I've been cellaring it in my lager fridge, which is like at 1, and so it actually I found it develops. I did somewhere I tasted where it was like in the cellar fridge, which is at 12. But the stuff at 1, the old stuff at 1, is actually really, really good. Like it fell apart at 12 after about 2 years, 3 years. It just started getting a bit just losing its life. But the stuff you kept cold was like, whoa.
Well, because obviously it's like the whatever it is, RNA equation, where it's basically any doubling of temperature, or any extra 10 degrees of temperature doubles the rate of decay, essentially.
I just think I'm doing a 4-year lagering, that's all.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a lager, so you can do that. It's fine. It makes it better.
I hear you saying, because like I've just gotten into home brewing since last year, and I've started experimenting a whole lot of styles I've never used to drink, and some of them I've never even tried before. But as you say, just going through these guidelines, it's like, wow, that sounds pretty cool. I'm gonna try that.
But it's a huge part of it's
pretty
a huge
cool.
part of the beauty of the hobby, isn't it? Like, I mean, that's what's always sort of romanced me with the whole thing, is it's like, I'm not a huge historian, but it is history you can drink at the same time, and you sort of get romanced on what something sounds like, and you make something that might not be true to style exactly, but it's something that's amazing to you as well. And I think that's the beauty of the whole game too. And it's sort of probably back to like, I've found in my career that at some point I'm really like interested in styles, and probably now I'm hitting a point where I'm like less interested in styles because I feel like I can follow the rules, but now I'm less interested in following the rules. And you may find the same thing. It's really, but I mean, the style guidelines are an amazing place to start, because you get this whole like parcel of information about those types of beer and what they should be like. And often there's no commercial examples in New Zealand, particularly, or no good commercial examples. Like it might be really old imported stuff for a lot of like German styles and things. So yeah, it's pretty good.
It's hard. Trying to get good Germans in New Zealand is tough. And there's some great ones, but they're just, every now and then when you get a good one, it's like Nirvana, but most of them are pretty shit by the time you get down here, which is sad.
Even a simple like German Weiss beer, like fuck. We brewed one, it's in kegs now, and I'm pretty happy with it. And but honestly, like I've been brewing them for like 5 years, and I would say this is probably the first one where I'm like, it did everything I expected it to do. So, and I was like, okay, I predicted that, and I did this, and I predicted that, and I did this, because they get quite sulfury and various things. And I think finally, like, I actually completely had control over it, which just is experience with those different yeasts as well. Like, it's just practice and practice again and practice again. And I think that's the bit that, yeah, it's the real, the je ne sais quoi, is like knowing what to do with a lot of those yeast today. Like it's
with your German beer, so I'm just going to take us on a tangent because it's one thing we've never talked about. It's like, with your Weiss beers, how are you doing the balance of, in terms of your ester phenol? Are you doing it in terms of massive, or are you doing hybrid co-fermentation, a couple of yeasts with different biases? I mean, which approach are you using in terms of your wheat beers? Because you've always got a very nice balance between your phenols and your esters. But I think it's one thing that most home brewers struggle with is, because I mean, people, Hefes or anything of those Weiss beers are all about that balance of, clophenolic versus that, those lovely kind of banana esters, but it's hard to try and get them into play. And there's lots of different ways you can do it. I was curious how you approach it.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one very dear to my heart because I have strong feelings on it. But in my opinion, I tend to prefer slightly more phenol-driven Weiss beers if they're pale, and ester-driven if they're dark. So consequently, I tend to use, if I was doing a pale wheat beer, I would tend to use the classic Weihenstephan wheat strain. So whatever it is, White Labs 300 or 3068 Y yeast, because it's quite simple. It's dominantly banana and clove. It attenuates really well and it attenuates fast. It's a sulfur producer, but it does it quite early on in ferment, and you can off-gas it quite adequately. And so for me, that works really well in like a pale wheat. Then if you're looking in a dark wheat, I much prefer the alternate strain, which is, it's also from the Weihenstephan bank, but it's like White Labs Hefeweizen 4. And it's far less banana and clove. It's much more stone fruit. I think the phenol range that you get out of it is not just dominantly clove. I think you also get a little bit of sort of anise and other spices as well, pepper. But then the problem is it's a bit shit at attenuating. So unless you want quite a high terminal gravity beer, you need to then also blend in a little bit of, I tend to blend in a little bit of the other Weihenstephan strain for attenuation, just while I'm propagating it. And that would be, who knows, 70-30, 60-40, something like that sort of blend. But then, like, obviously fermentation temperature is really king with these yeasts as well. So like, I personally prefer starting cold, and then for our Hefes, like our straight Weiss beers, I would go up to, I would hold it 19 or 19.5 for the majority of fermentation, but I'd hold it cold for the first probably 24 hours.
By cold, you mean what, a couple of degrees colder, or?
Yeah, like 17, something like that. I mean, they're very voracious yeasts. They're very, if you give them a lot of like nutrients, if you give them a lot of simple sugars and a lot of amino nitrogen, stuff like that, they'll go absolutely batshit, and they'll fucking plaster your walls, for you. But unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily always produce the best fermentation characters. So I like to restrict them at the start, knock them back in that first initial stage when they're sort of having at all the simple sugars, and then allow them to warm up for the bulk of fermentation, and then they can get warmer at the end, kind of thing. That's how I like doing it anyway. I mean, people differ in what they like as well. Like, so our latest Hefe, like, I think, in my opinion, it's pretty much 50-50 between banana and clove. Like, I really think it's striking it down the middle, which I like. Whereas, like, other people that I work with, they think it could do with more banana. So you can ferment it warmer. But for me, like, when you get too much banana, it starts smelling a bit like glue.
Yes, but the spice on this is wicked. It's the spicy notes and like those lovely kind of like, it's almost a little bit of cinnamon and stuff that sits in there as well. But the bit that blew me away about this beer is, I think, it's the layered malt in it. It's almost got a bit of like a Duvel kind of character. You get those beautiful kind of soft layered sort of toffee sugars sitting on top of the malt. That's just like yum.
Yeah. And so my big secret on that, and it's not really that huge a secret, is that in these sort of beers where you're looking for that sort of continental malt complexity, I always like to do a blend on the base malt as well. So like, rather than just running with just Pilsner malt and then specialty malts to make up color and flavor, you actually need to look for complexity in the base malt composition as well. So always that blend between Pils, Vienna, and Munich, and even dark Munich, is really key for me in these styles, continental styles. And that's what the Germans, and that's what well, particularly the Germans, that's what they would do. So like a lot of and it's the same in the lager world for them as well, like not just the ales, like the American craft brewing world would look for that complexity in specialty malts, and in Europe they would look for it in base malts.
Yeah,
and
that explains a lot actually, because that beer's got like the mid-tones in it, are just wicked.
Yeah, and it's about that. It's about remembering that it's not about like specialty malts, not the be all and end all of your malt complexity. It's actually base malt as well, because that's the by far the larger proportion by weight. So yeah, I mean that's my take, and plenty of people feel differently as well. I would also add that caveat.
No, it's good. By what you're selling?
I think they're wrong. But,
I tend to agree. No, Americans are like that. I mean, they like simple answers to things. I mean, you look at the way they approach sours and everything else like that. It's all about sort of having a single point where you can control, rather than a series of layers. I just think it's a very, very different style of brewing.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's like, I mean, my favorite ones are like sort of, there's a fantastic comparison in my opinion, is amber lager styles. You know, is like there is the American New World school and there is the more traditional school, and they're quite different. You know, and I'm sure you're very aware, like having drunk a couple of them in your time, that like they, to me, present as very different beers. You can taste, for me, like the American specialty. So for instance, like a Vienna lager or Märzen or something like that, like, you know, malty amber lager, like you can taste specialty malts sitting separate from the base, in my opinion, which is fine, and that can still make a really tasty beer. But then you have like the ones where it's literally just base malt. It's like just Munich and dark Munich, bit of Vienna, bit of Pils, maybe a tiny little bit of like dehusked dark malt, and that's it. And it's amazing. And it's
Bring
like,
back the malt.
yeah, it's good.
I mean, that's the thing I take away from tonight. Actually, is you listen to you talking about the English malts, because it's so true. And I mean, like, you know, I mean, we're lucky. Glenfields are great, and they produce some great malts. But they also, I mean, there isn't the nuance that you get from the continental malts, and a lot of the malts that they're growing aren't like the barley wasn't designed for the, you know, they're from, you know, more from production malt for non-beer thing as a base than those lovely sort of, you know, bred over, you know, God knows how many generations for the purpose of beer.
Totally. And like a lot of those heritage malts, which have such amazing depth of flavor and character, are also not agronomically that great. I mean, same as Rewalker. I mean, Rewalker is an absolute bog for the growers to grow, but they still grow it because they know that they can get the returns on it. And it's the same thing with like heritage and specialty malts as well, like Marisotto. It's not a good barley to grow, but it fucking makes amazing beer. And so there's actually a whole bunch of stuff like that. There's like Chevalier, and there's a whole bunch of heritage malts coming back in sort of in the UK, which are all really quite exciting in my opinion. Like, and I think we tend to, I mean, we're all guilty sometimes of thinking of malt merely as the vessel for carrying sugar to produce fermentation, but like, yeah, it's easy to underestimate, and it's still a hugely integral part of what you drink. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic for me recently.
You know, the heritage of the malt and the growers keep on growing and be paid for what they're growing. I mean, that's a fundamental, right?
Exactly. And I mean, like, there's lots of farmers in the UK and in England, Scotland and stuff, who are now growing heritage malts because they can get consequently higher payouts, even though they'll get lower yields. And there's lots of demand for it. I mean,
with food bread and that kind of stuff, same sort of thing, right?
Yeah. It's funny, it's something that hasn't even remotely touched base in New Zealand yet. I don't know if we're big enough or not, but we've got the agricultural structure. But I mean, like, I was amazed in talking to some of the guys in Belgium too, and in Germany, like, yeah, how much they're just like small. Like a brewery will literally buy everything that 1 or 2 maltsters can produce, and maltsters can make a great living off it. And the brewery's got suddenly a bit of product differentiation, and that seems to be popping up way more than I thought. It's just gone like boom. It's cool.
Well, I mean, if you guys want my 2 cents on that matter as well, like I definitely think in New Zealand it will be working more back towards that than it probably ever has before as well. Certainly as like the industry matures, a lot of us who are already like quite reasonably sized will probably continue to grow. People who are already small will probably continue to stay small. We'll probably have unparalleled ability to actually be able to dictate, well, not even dictate, actually work back in with suppliers and actually truly truly recognize it as like a bit of a two-way exchange with our growers as well. I mean, for instance, the Rewalker that you've been enjoying there, David, like I said, we actually went back to New Zealand hops and we said, hey, look, we did this batch of beer with this one batch of hops from you guys. It's fucking awesome. We'd love to know who farmed it because we want to get in contact with them and just thank them, basically. And then I did that. And it dominantly came from one farmer, Mac Hops, and the manager of Mac Hops like called me up on the day I emailed him, and he called me up and said, "So nice to hear from a brewer about such a positive thing because we never normally hear it." So I basically emailed him and I said, "Your hops are great." I just said, "Your hops are great. We used it in this beer. Can you send you this beer, please? Because it's great and you should taste it." And all the staff who went into making it. And then I learned a whole bunch extra about how Rewalker's growing and how they grow it and what they do differently and stuff like that. So it becomes a real two-way exchange rather than just this weird sort of commodity market where we're just taking these ingredients and like adding them and sort of, oh, great, that batch was really good.
Everyone's part of the process. Yeah.
Because you actually raise a really wicked point that I'd never thought about before. I mean, there's, the craft brewers in New Zealand, we get decent sized ones, like, because it's hard to do when you got lots of small. You've actually got the ability to make a massive difference to a producer. And you're right, like if you're looking to make a point of difference, you can turn around to someone who's like got a little idea and it's fledgling away, and you've got enough buying power and well, the ability to buy enough that it actually makes their concept viable as a business. And that's actually quite a cool side. I'd never even thought about it. Like a great side effect in terms of the growth of the mid-sized breweries in New Zealand. And we're probably not at that point yet. I mean, like we don't have that kind of exponential feed. All our breweries are still pretty small, but we're not too far off it where you can actually,
Yeah. No, totally agree. And it's something that no doubt happened in the US, like I'm sure in the 90s or something like that. But I think we're probably getting to a maturity of market now where some of us are getting big enough that we can actually start having these relationships and like working in a lot more. And I mean, the amazing thing too is for us, like, it's a funny one with like someone like New Zealand Hops where it's a cooperative and lots of farms feed in and they produce a product and then you buy the product and you're the end user of it or the semi-end user of it. Because in the past, it's not been very personal. And I think for the first time, it's opening up a lot more to actually those much more direct relationships whereby we have enough buying power to now start saying, actually, we only want to buy hops from this farm because they make fucking great hops. And the farmer is stoked about it because they can go into the supermarket and buy our beer and go, that's our hops every time. And we're stoked about it because we get quality and continuity of someone that we really trust. And New Zealand Hops loves it, or whoever the salesperson is, because they're buying 2 tons of Rewalker. And everyone's quite happy. So it's quite an exciting time in that side of it. And it's something that I'm starting to work in with a lot more as actual raw ingredients, which like I've never probably done before. So yeah, good fun.
Oh, wicked, man.
I'll know more in like.
I really like this Weiser book. I think it's actually, Sometimes it gets a bit boozy. Like, I mean, I know it's hard with these big beers. Sometimes how like the ethanol can kind of just sit over the top, but this just sings.
Yeah, yeast selection. I'm telling you, key.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Scott, for sharing so much of your time.
That's right.
It's been brilliant. You've shown us your soul. spoken from your heart, and we really appreciate that. Thank you.
No worries, pleasure. And I'm sure it might just be like a handful of us left anyway. But cheers as always. Great to see you both. Well, and the rest of you obviously as well.